somewhere in Washington right now, a decision is sitting on a desk that most people watching this have never heard discussed, and it is not a decision about missiles or troop numbers. It is a decision about timing, because in situations like this, the choice that ends up shaping history is rarely the dramatic one everyone is watching for. It is the quiet one, the procedural one, the one buried in a briefing document that nobody outside a handful of rooms will ever read. And if you understand how that kind of decision tends to move through a system under pressure, you can see the shape of what comes next before it actually happens. That is what we are going to do today, not predict headlines. Read structure. I want to be upfront about something before we go further. I am not going to stand here and tell you I have inside information nobody else has. I am not going to give you a countdown, a clock, or a date circled in red. What I am going to do is walk you through the mechanics of how decisions like this tend to unfold, the incentives pulling on the people making them, and economic tripwires that get triggered long before any dramatic headline hits your phone. Because by the time the headline arrives, the smart money has usually already moved. The question is whether you see it coming or read about it after the fact. Let's start with where things actually stand, stripped of the noise. Tensions around Iran have been building in cycles for years, and each cycle tends to follow a similar pattern. Diplomatic language hardens, military posturing increases, oil markets get twitchy. Then either a de-escalation happens quietly, or something breaks the pattern and pushes things a level higher. What makes the current moment worth paying attention to isn't any single event. It's the accumulation. Energy markets are already sensitive. Global supply chains are still recovering from years of shocks they haven't fully absorbed. And the political appetite in several capitals, not just Washington, for another prolonged, expensive entanglement in the region is thin. Thin appetite combined with high stakes is exactly the kind of environment where decisions get made fast, under pressure, with incomplete information. That is the setup. Now let's talk about why it matters far beyond the region itself. Here is the thing most coverage misses. A crisis involving Iran was never really a story about Iran alone. It is a story about choke points. About a third of the world's seaborne oil passes through waters that Iran can, in a serious enough scenario, make dangerous or unpredictable to move through. You don't need a blockade to spook a market. You need uncertainty. Insurance premiums on tankers spike. Shipping companies reroute. Delivery timelines stretch. And within days, not months, the effects show up in fuel prices on the other side of the planet, in countries that have no direct stake in the conflict at all. That is the first ripple. It is the fastest one, and it is the one most people actually notice because it hits them at the gas pump. But the second ripple is slower and honestly more consequential, and almost nobody talks about it in real time because it doesn't make for a dramatic thumbnail. It's what happens to confidence. Markets don't just price in what has happened. They price in what might happen. So the moment serious escalation becomes plausible, even before a single additional shot is fired, you see it in bond yields, in currency hedging, in how central banks quietly adjust their reserve positions. None of that requires war. It only requires enough uncertainty that institutions start protecting themselves instead of taking risks. And when enough institutions do that at the same time, the caution itself becomes the shock. Nobody has to fire the first move. Everybody just has to flinch in the same direction at once. Now, let's talk about why a ground-level military escalation specifically, if it happened, would be a different category of event than anything we've seen in the region over the past 2 decades. Iran is not Iraq in 2003, and it is not a comparison that serious analysts make lightly. The terrain alone is a factor most casual observers underestimate. Mountain ranges, dispersed population centers, a geography that has shaped Iranian military doctrine for generations around the assumption that any invading force will pay a steep and prolonged price for every mile of territory. Whatever your view on the politics of the region, that is simply a fact about the map. Add to that a domestic political environment in the West where the public appetite for another open-ended commitment is measurably lower than it was even a decade ago, and you start to see why any decision maker weighing that option is weighing something enormously heavier than a limited air campaign. And here's where the story usually loses people, so stay with me, because this is the part that actually explains the global economic shock in the title. A prolonged, resource-intensive conflict in that region doesn't just cost money in the direct sense, fuel, equipment, and you start to see why any decision maker weighing that option is weighing something enormously heavier than a limited air campaign. And here's where the story usually loses people, so stay with me. And in a world where more than one major power is watching how committed, how stretched, and how patient a rival actually is, that kind of prolonged commitment sends a signal whether anyone intends it to or not. Other capitals adjust their own calculations accordingly. Not dramatically, not overnight, but incrementally, the way a chess player adjusts a strategy the moment they notice their opponent's attention has shifted to the other side of the board. This is where the idea of a slow migration away from a single dominant currency and financial architecture comes in. And I want to be careful here because this is one of the most overstated and most misunderstood trends in financial commentary right now. It is real, but it is not sudden, and it is not a single event you'll wake up to one morning. It looks like a handful of countries settling more trade in currencies other than the dollar. It looks like central banks modestly diversifying reserve holdings over years, not weeks. It looks like new trade corridors and payment systems being built quietly as insurance policies rather than replacements. None of that is collapse. All of it is friction. And friction, compounded over a long enough timeline, changes outcomes even without a single dramatic breaking point. That is the pattern worth watching, not because it's imminent, but because it's already underway, and a serious regional escalation would be an accelerant, not the cause. So what does all of this actually mean for you sitting here watching this video, not running a hedge fund or sitting in a situation room? It means paying attention to a different set of signals than the ones cable news puts on screen. Watch energy markets for sustained moves, not single-day spikes, because single-day spikes are noise and sustained moves are signal. Watch how central banks talk about reserve diversification in their quarterly communications, because institutions rarely announce big shifts. They just quietly do them and let the data catch up later. Watch shipping insurance rates for the region, because underwriters price risk before politicians admit risk exists. None of these require you to be an expert. They just require you to know where to look instead of waiting for a headline to tell you what already happened weeks ago. I also want to address the strongest counterargument honestly, because I think you deserve that instead of a one-sided narrative built to keep you anxious for 20 minutes. There is a real possibility that none of the escalation scenarios play out. Diplomatic off-ramps exist and have been used successfully before more than once. The economic and political costs of a serious escalation are so high on every side that de-escalation remains, by a wide margin, the more historically likely outcome in any given cycle of tension. Most crises like this over the past several decades have cooled rather than boiled over. That track record matters, and anyone telling you catastrophe is certain is not being straight with you. What I'm describing today isn't a prediction that the worst outcome happens. It's a map of what the pressure points are so that if things do shift, you're not caught flat-footed. And if they don't, you've still learned something durable about how these systems actually work. Here's what I'd ask you to genuinely sit with after this video ends. We tend to think about global stability as something that either holds or breaks, like a dam, but it's closer to a negotiation that never fully ends, constantly being repriced by thousands of decision makers who are each trying to protect their own position while reading everyone else's next move. The story isn't really about Iran or the United States or any single flashpoint. It's about how a system with that many moving, self-interested parts behaves under sustained pressure, and whether the incentives pulling everyone toward caution are stronger than the incentives pulling toward escalation. Right now, both sets of incentives exist, pulling in opposite directions, and which one wins isn't decided yet. If this kind of structural breakdown, looking past the headlines to the actual incentives underneath, is useful to you, that's exactly the kind of analysis this channel is built around, and there's more of it coming as this situation develops. I genuinely like to know what you think. Do you believe the pressure toward de-escalation is strong enough to hold the way it has in past cycles? Or do you think this moment is genuinely different? Leave your reasoning in the comments, not just your verdict, because the reasoning is where the interesting conversation actually happens. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next